So the human rights reporting on Syria began with documenting attacks on peaceful protesters. But throughout the years, we've started as Amnesty International and other human rights organizations looking into patterns of violations that were happening inside of Syria by both the Syrian government and the armed opposition groups. As Amnesty, we focused a lot on patterns of attacks on civilians and civilian objects, including the use of indiscriminate weapons and weapons that are prohibited under international humanitarian law, such as cluster munitions. Most recently, we looked at the pattern of forced displacement that was happening across Syria. We identified four areas that were subjected to forced displacement. The Syrian government presented these efforts as reconciliation efforts with civilians, but in fact, in reality, they were preceded by prolonged sieges and attacks on civilians and civilian objects, compelling armed groups to surrender, but also leading to the forced displacement or the mass displacement of civilians from government-controlled areas to opposition-controlled areas. In terms of the media, we've seen that the media has been focusing more and more on breaking news type of situations, such as, for instance, Eastern Ghouta, where there was an escalation in violence, which fit the pattern of what we documented in terms of the government's coercive strategy of compelling armed groups to surrender. And what we've seen in Eastern Ghouta exactly fits the same pattern or narrative in terms of imposing a very prolonged siege for more than 4 years, but also escalating attacks in the weeks or months preceding the start of the negotiations between the government and the armed opposition groups. So we see that the media is less so interested in other types of violations, such as detention and enforced disappearances by the government, but also abduction by the armed opposition groups. In terms of one of Amnesty International's core work is, in addition to research and campaigns, since we are a campaign organization, it's advocacy. And for every single report that we publish, we meet or we request meetings with the international community, such as European Union or European member states, the US, Russia, including as well as Iran and Turkey, to go through the recommendations that we include in our reports. Of course, in some of these stakeholders or these states that have some kind of influence over the Syrian government, which would include Russia, Iran. We do not see any specific interest in taking up our recommendations and using it to influence the Syrian government to implement these recommendations. However, with the international community involving Western countries such as EU countries and the EU itself, we do see that our recommendations are taken on board, are more or less discussed. But however, given their very limited influence over the Syrian government, we don't see these recommendations materializing. However, now as Amnesty, we're calling on the EU governments and the European Union to use its influence or ensure that in the post-war scenario that we're seeing now, acknowledging that the war is ongoing, but given that the government has captured around 40% of the country, if not more, we're urging the EU and European governments to make sure that the UN agencies on the ground inside of Syria include reparation to the victims and their families. Such as making sure that they have access to legal remedies and ensure that the government provides them with compensation to the loss that they endured as a result of the conflict. In addition, the EU has been and European governments have been very interested or trying to push the whole accountability narrative, which is very crucial. And they've played a very pivotal role, important role in pushing the recent mechanism which was adopted by the UN General Assembly, the IIIM, which will work on investigating crimes with the view of prosecution in the future. So in that sense, Western countries or the EU has played a very important role in providing funding, but also providing the intention to support it in the future. In terms of a post-war in Syria, I mean, it's starting to unfold very slowly. It's in terms of how we see civilians living in a post-war Syria, it's still, unclear. However, if the government continues with its actions or practices that it has been, implementing before 2011 and post 2011, then we don't see civilians, being protected by the government. The government has to take serious and concrete measures in order to ensure that any displaced person, whether refugee or internally displaced person, can safely, voluntarily, and with dignity return back to Syria. And for that, the government needs to change the laws that it has when it comes to um, enforced appearances, arbitrary detention, the ability to claim their property, which we have seen that the recent law on reconstruction has been severely flawed in the sense of protecting IDPs. But also they would need to provide protection measures on the ground to ensure that civilians who are going back are not there aren't any retaliation against them or discriminated against them for the fact of either having previously lived in government in opposition controlled areas or in neighboring countries outside of Syria.